I rise, Madam Speaker, to Madam Speaker, I rise to close this afternoon to close the budget debate on the appropriation bill for the upcoming fiscal year 2023-24. I take the opportunity, Madam Speaker, to welcome all those who are joining this debate, Jamaicans who are joining online, joining on radio and on television, through the YouTube portal, through Twitter and Facebook, and to thank them for their participation. The debate, Madam Speaker, has been vibrant, it has been passionate, and it has been colorful. On behalf of the people of Jamaica, I want to thank the contributors to the debate, the Most Honorable Prime Minister, for delivering a presentation of substance, of achievement, of hope. And we should have just done the budget debate right there, so. But we have to come back and finish it. Nobody's going to break the PM's stride. He's going to keep on moving the ball forward for the Jamaican people. I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his presentation. There may have been a few yellow card moments, but we understand the pressure that he is under. I also thank the opposition spokesman on finance for his presentation, for the points made. Some of the criticisms leveled, it was tough, but constructive. Thanks to you, Madam Speaker, for the excellent job that you have been doing in maintaining the order of these proceedings. And thanks to the parliamentary staff, the clerk, the deputy clerk, the marshals, the stenographers, and all who work at the Houses of Parliament for their dedication and support. And thanks to the Financial Secretary and the entire staff at the Ministry of Finance, and of course, Minister of State, Marshall Smith. I thank my security detail, Madam Speaker, and driver, and I express gratitude to my family for their loving support. The media who faithfully report on these proceedings, Madam Speaker, we also owe a debt of gratitude too. Madam Speaker, the budget debate takes place in the context of a historic economic recovery. And it begs repeating, Madam Speaker, that in real terms, economic output exceeds economic output prior to COVID, and unemployment levels achieved in April of 2022 of 6% are lower than pre-COVID and the lowest in our history. The employment gained, in April 2022 of persons was also the highest number of people employed in Jamaica's history at 1.269 million and 300 persons, 1.2693. And debt is also lower today than prior to the pandemic. And with the exception of Guyana, Jamaica is the only country in this hemisphere for which all three of these were true in 2022. This is a remarkable achievement for all of us in Jamaica. Even in this Caribbean region, many of our counterparts have not achieved pre-COVID levels of economic output yet. Madam Speaker, we will preserve, maintain, and share the gains of economic reform and economic recovery. And as I said in my opening presentation, Jamaica, because of our size, position, economic structure, we will continue to feel economic shocks from adverse events that we have no control over, and we can't stop them. But we can't leave our development hostage to these forces. And as such, we must take responsibility for our own vulnerability and adequately prepare to respond quickly and effectively to such shocks. Madam Speaker, over 50 years, we have been hit by many of these. And as we showed during the COVID-19 economic shock and recovery, we're committed to breaking this cycle and to changing this historical narrative. Madam Speaker, over the next 2 years, Jamaica is likely to attain debt levels lower than at any time in the last 50 years. We have to keep on the trajectory to get there. Okay, but if we keep on it, we're likely to get to a point where our debt levels are lower than at any point in the last 50 years. Madam Speaker, the 30-year odyssey of FinSAC and the longer arc of high debt over, say, a 50-year period has taught us a lesson, as I said in my own budget presentation, that it's easy to put debt on and very hard to take it off. A single policy, Madam Speaker, can add mountains of debt. Now, what that does, as we've discussed, it strangles the chances of a generation as servicing interest upon top of interest over half a century. Madam Speaker, has robbed generations of opportunities for a better life. And high debt has made economic crises worse. High debt has made economic shocks more severe. High debt has reduced fiscal space and flexibility needed to respond to economic shocks. And as such, Madam Speaker, we have had lengthy, decade-long periods of economic recovery that have impeded our social, economic, and national development. As I mentioned in my budget speech, Madam Speaker, high debt is not the metric itself, it's the proxy for something a little more meaningful, which is the cost of servicing that debt. And we live in a world, as I mentioned, where price is money based on the perceived ability to repay. And those who are viewed as having the least ability to repay get charged the most. Such is the reality of our world. So as I mentioned then, Madam Speaker, we cannot follow President Joe Biden and the United States, who borrow trillions and trillions. No matter, they might borrow it for good reasons, but they borrow trillions and trillions, push past 100% of GDP, and launch programs in their country. Despite their relatively high levels of debt, their average cost is only 2% of GDP. So although, Madam Speaker, our debt is lower at 80% of GDP, it costs us 5% of GDP to service. So even though we have lower debt, the cost of our debt is 250% more. So we can't follow them. And if we try to follow them, Madam Speaker, what would happen is that our interest rates would rise faster and the share of GDP dedicated to servicing debt would also rise. And I want to just repeat something that I said in my budget presentation. This above all, know thyself and to thine own self be true. Our debt has to be maintained at levels, Madam Speaker, that are consistent with our economic structure and makeup. Now, we are part of CARICOM, which is a high debt area. And so we've been in this paradigm for a long time, and it's become normalized. But even there, we have to observe more closely. You know, St. Vincent and the Grenadines has debt of about 88% of GDP. So when you hang out with Sir Ralph, you might think you're doing better than it because your debt is only 80%. And you might be persuaded to feel comfortable because you have company. But when you look a little more closely at what Sir Ralph's interest is costing him, when we were piling up debt instead of piling on market debt, instead of taking on multilateral debt, Madam Speaker, we would go and offer things on the market, come back and pat ourselves for how much it's been oversubscribed. You know, you're going to get oversubscribed if you're paying 12% in the context of legal arrangements and structures that make it difficult to default. So we were engaged in an exercise of fooling ourselves, Madam Speaker. Didn't take Audley Shaw's advice. Interest ran up to 17% of GDP. We have brought it down to 5%, right, over our 7 years and the previous 3 years of the economic reform program from 2013 to 2013, 14, and 15. But, Madam Speaker, debt service still takes up a lot of fiscal space at 5% of GDP. So what would happen is that we'd hang out with Sir Ralph and think that we have company in this high debt game. But Sir Ralph ain't no fool. When you look at how much his interest costs him in St. Vincent, it costs them 2.5% of GDP, Madam Speaker, even though they have more debt than we have today. So while we pay 5% of GDP on debt that is 8% of GDP, Sir Ralph is paying 2.5% of GDP on debt that is 88% of GDP. So we can't follow the United States and we can't follow Sir Ralph either. But it's not just Sir Ralph. And just to be clear, you know, St. Vincent may have had access to certain kinds of concessional loans that we wouldn't have qualified for. But the general point is applicable, that the constitution of our debt is all these market interest rate debt that high in price, which makes it stubborn, and that 5% chokes even today what we are able to do. But it's not just St. Vincent. Grenada, Madam Speaker, they have a little less than us at 70% of GDP, and it only costs them 2% of GDP to service. Now, I want to put that into context. If we had their level of interest costs in terms of percentage of GDP, it would allow us to commit another $150 billion to public investment. And let's put it another way, Madam Speaker. If we had Grenada's cost of debt service as a percentage of GDP, we could triple capital expenditure. Just imagine the transformative impact that that could have. Instead of 200 buses, we'll be talking about underground trains and high-speed railways. So when I hear the opposition leader talk about paying down debt too fast, he doesn't get it, Madam Speaker. Doesn't get it. He has an ambition for Jamaica, no genuine ambition. Because the cost of servicing is one of the major things holding our country back. It makes our economy risky, it reduces flexibility, and therefore raises the chances of economic reversal becoming the outcome of economic shock. So today, using the best assumptions of today, Madam Speaker, projections show that we could hit our 60% debt target in 4 years, March 2027, instead of 5 in 2028. Now, that's a good development, Madam Speaker, as we would more rapidly move away from the danger zone where reversal is always lurking around the corner after some economic shock. And it is also good as more fiscal space will become available more quickly. But the opposition leader, by his choice of words, would want you to believe that we are taking on revenues and spending it to prematurely reduce debt. Madam Speaker, that is untrue. Untrue. Our nominal debt, that is the Jamaican dollar equivalent of our debt, is in the same ballpark. It's slightly lower than it was a year ago, but the same general ballpark. Our debt to GDP ratio, and remember that is a ratio, is declining faster than previously planned because of the performance of our economy. Madam Speaker, we have recovered a full year earlier than we expected, and as a consequence, at this point, we are ahead in debt reduction as well. But this is performance, and performance, Madam Speaker, is always a good thing. Now, we can't get too giddy about being a year ahead and take our eyes off the ball and engage in adventures as a result, because as of now, this is just a projection of what our profile could look like 4 or 5 years from now. If we are ahead by a year and had, say, 3 years to play with, that would be a different thing, right? But, you know, God forbid anything can happen. We're a small, open economy that experiences frequent shocks. So it is good to have this buffer in our debt reduction trajectory. Now, Madam Speaker, as we preserve gains and maintain gains, as I mentioned in my budget presentation, we will also share gains, Madam Speaker. And we share gains through expenditure that benefits everyone. And that is public expenditure that improves quality of life. We shared with you a vast program of public investment activities that includes improvement to public transportation through the acquisition of 200 new electric buses over 3 years, improvement to sanitation with 50 garbage trucks, construction modernization of 3 hospitals at the same time, Cornwall Regional, Western Children, and Spanish Town Hospital, and over 10 clinics over the next few years. Improvement to our highway infrastructure through the simultaneous pursuit of 4 highway projects at the same time that are at different stages of development. The Southern Coastal Road Improvement Project, the Montego Bay Bypass Project, the North Coast Highway Expansion Project, which is now in its feasibility stage, and as the Prime Minister mentioned, the project from Williamsfield going down into St. Elizabeth, which is at its initial conceptual stages. Yes, that's a big one, Madam Speaker. I know that clap is coming from no other than Minister Green. I don't have to look. Yeah. Madam Speaker, we're also improving our road network over 3 years through the $40 billion Spark program to improve 2,000 roads across our country. We're developing a 9-acre park on the Kingston waterfront, a 26-acre park in Portmore, a new town centre in Morant Bay and Port Antonio, and new police stations in Westmoreland and St. Catherine. And these are just some of the public investment projects that are in the pipeline, Madam Speaker, as we share the gains through expenditure that everyone benefits from. Madam Speaker, we're also sharing the gains through the microeconomy by increasing the minimum wage by 44%, the largest increase in Jamaica's history, Madam Speaker, and increasing the rate of NIS pension by 72%, and the NHT loan limit ceiling, Madam Speaker, by 1 million to 7.5 million. This year, Madam Speaker, we'll offer permanent employment to cooks and assistant cooks in our primary schools and watchmen at our schools and caregivers in infant schools and sanitation workers at NSWMA who are currently on contract, provided that they've completed the required probationary periods and they work full-time hours. But, Madam Speaker, the opposition leader who just walked in kind of misrepresented our position with respect to the reform of contract employment, because he characterized our actions as limited to those we provided examples for. Madam Speaker, though I would absolutely relish the opportunity and I would enjoy it in abundance, I can't speak about all categories of contract workers in a single speech. What I did do, though, Madam Speaker, even as I gave those specific examples, I said that cooks, assistant cooks, watchmen, and caregivers who work within the Ministry of Education will be part of 8,000 contract workers who will be made permanent, Madam Speaker, this year. And I also said, Madam Speaker, that this would form part of the Reform for Contract Work in the Public Sector program, which will be a comprehensive program that looks at the problem across government, which is why we're going to need 3 years to implement it. And as many, we don't know the exact number yet, but as many as 20,000 contract workers who work full-time hours, who have completed a probationary period, Madam Speaker, would be made permanent over the next 3 years. Get it right, opposition leader, get it right. Madam Speaker, I want, in my opening budget presentation, I would have updated this House that the government had reached agreement with groups representing 60,000 employees. Well, Madam Speaker, during this, my closing budget presentation, I'm pleased to update this House and the country that the government has now reached agreements with several other unions, bargaining groups, and staff associations that allows the implementation to have either begun earlier or to shortly begin. And we anticipate, Madam Speaker, that before long, that number of 60,000, Madam Speaker, will become 105,000 government employees, or 95% of the public service, once we sign off with the rank and file members of the police who have written indicating the acceptance of the government's offer. And the fiscal risks of which I was concerned, and I shared my concern at the time, Madam Speaker, with employees of the government of Jamaica and with the people of Jamaica more generally, that specific risk, based on if the condition I just described a while ago is met, meaning that all groups sign off, we would have averted that particular fiscal risk. Madam Speaker, we expect that certainly for the groups who have signed, the retroactive payments will be paid out this month. It may not come on the 25th clearly because a lot of agreements were just signed. Some of them have been signed today, the date of 21st. But we will endeavor that the funds will leave the consolidated fund by the end of the month. Madam Speaker, I stood here 2 weeks ago and I appealed to the men and women in occupational groups who had not yet signed. And I appealed, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank all members of the public service who responded positively and decisively. Madam Speaker, over 80% of teachers who voted cast their votes in support of the public sector compensation restructuring reform. And I want to say thank you to all our teachers, Madam Speaker. Approximately $12 billion, 11.8 to be exact, will be paid to our teachers, Madam Speaker, in the month of March. Madam Speaker, over 95% of doctors who voted cast their votes in support of the public sector restructuring reform. And I want to say thank you to all our doctors. We had serious, genuine challenges, some of which were expressed in this House. I maintained that I was not going to negotiate in public, even though I was pressed on many radio and TV programs to do exactly that. Madam Speaker, I'm happy to report that we were able to have very constructive dialogue and find creative solutions, Madam Speaker. And as a result of that, $6.4 billion will be leaving the consolidated fund in March for our doctors who work in the public health system as retroactive payments under the restructuring exercise. Madam Speaker, over 86% of rank and file police who voted cast their votes in support of the public sector compensation restructuring reform in the form of the government's offer. And I want to say thank you to all our rank and file police officers. Madam Speaker, we are working on finalizing that agreement, and once it is finalized and signed, but only after that, the amount I mentioned in my opening budget presentation, $10.2 billion, will be paid out of the consolidated fund by the end of March for our rank and file police officers. Madam Speaker, I acknowledge our district constables and pay tribute to them and thank them for coming on board with this reform. Earlier this morning or this afternoon, Madam Speaker, just before coming to Parliament, one of the reasons why I came at the time I did. I signed the MOU on public sector restructuring, Madam Speaker, with the United District Constables Association. Madam Speaker, I acknowledge members of the fire brigade and pay tribute to them and thank them for coming on board with this reform over the last 2 weeks. I acknowledge, Madam Speaker, our legal officers and pay tribute to them and thank them for coming on board with this reform over the last 10 days, Madam Speaker. I also acknowledge our probation aftercare officers and pay tribute to them and thank them for coming on board with this reform. I also acknowledge and thank the unions that represent correctional officers for working with us in the way that they have. And there are others too, Madam Speaker. I thank all members of the public service, which number 105,000, Madam Speaker, who have indicated to the government acceptance of its offer, Madam Speaker. 95%, Madam Speaker, this reform is underway. What we have accomplished together, Madam Speaker, has never even been attempted before. Never been attempted, let alone done. Madam Speaker, it should have been done before. Should have been done before, but it wasn't. This is an historic restructuring of public sector compensation, Madam Speaker, which creates a simple, easy to understand, fairer, and more equitable compensation system that gives us a better opportunity to attract and retain the talent we need. There are now, Madam Speaker, 16 pay scales in the core civil service instead of 325, Madam Speaker. 16 instead of 325. And we have 3 additional scales for the teachers, healthcare practitioners, and security forces that are aligned to the core scale. Madam Speaker, this represents over 3 years of work, and that work no doubt continues. And we thank our partners in the unions, the staff associations and bargaining groups for working with the government of Jamaica and for agreeing to that 4-year wage deal from 2017 to 2021 that created the space to make the work required for this reform possible. And Madam Speaker, with the compensation agreement signings since my opening budget presentation, as I mentioned, the fiscal risk, Madam Speaker, is gradually receding. Madam Speaker, while it is important to recognize the milestone of reaching the point where over 95% of public officers have indicated acceptance of the government's offer, we still have work to do across the public sector to effect payments. The payroll system of government is decentralized and highly fragmented. And there's a project underway, a part of our transformation exercise, is to address this. And the Ministry of Finance is only a part of the payment exercise process. We issue instructions to ministries, departments, and agencies through the Madam Speaker, and through the Transformation Implementation Unit perform quality control checks. But the payroll departments of the particular ministry departments and agencies have an integral role, and we'll be working to support them to ensure that the implementation we expect towards the end of this month goes as smooth as it possibly can, given the late time frame of some of these agreements. So, Madam Speaker, we say in advance, thanks to those in the payroll systems across the public service who will be working feverishly. We'll be working night and day over the next days remaining in March to calculate and to effect payments. Thanks must also be expressed, Madam Speaker, to those at the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service, Minister Smith, the Financial Secretary, and in particular, Madam Speaker, the Transformation Implementation Unit led by Maria Thompson-Walters and the Strategic Human Resource Department led by Deputy Financial Secretary Wayne Jones. Madam Speaker, there was a time when targets seemed not to matter in Jamaica, as we would hardly ever attain them. And we certainly would not have attained these targets on a consistent basis. Over the decade 2003, fiscal years 2003-4 to 2012-13 inclusive, we missed our fiscal targets every single year by large amounts. Yeah, but it covers both administrations from 2003-4 to 12-13, right? We missed our fiscal targets every single year, except for one. You know, I've been trained, Madam Speaker, to respond promptly to your gavel.
It's not a joke. Your time for speaking has expired.
Madam Speaker, for a moment I thought that government a call to order. Madam Speaker, the member's time having expired, I beg to move that it be extended sufficiently to allow him to conclude his presentation.
Members, a question before the House is that the member's time for speaking has expired and that he be given sufficient time to complete his presentation. Those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So what I was saying, Madam Speaker, is that over the decade 2003-4 to 2012-13, and I'm including the time when we were, in office as well, just a fact that we missed our targets in that decade every single year, except for one in 2010-2011. I have a chart I was going to show it to you, but somehow this is not up and running just yet, which I'm hoping there's somebody who can attend to that so that the charts that we have on hand can be shown to the Parliament and by extension, the people of Jamaica.
Another issue.
Madam Speaker, over the 9 subsequent years, from 2013-14 to 2021-22, we cannot talk about this year yet, it's not yet ended, Jamaica exceeded our fiscal targets every single year. So 3 times, Madam Speaker, under the previous administration, 2013-14, 14-15, and 15-16, targets were achieved. And all 6 years that have been completed so far, 3 + 6, making 9. We have shown, Madam Speaker, over the past 9 years that consistently achieving targets delivers tremendous value for Jamaica. And let me just speak about our tenure in office. We have shown, Madam Speaker, over the last 7 years that pursuing, achieving, and surpassing targets builds fiscal credibility. And, Madam Speaker, with fiscal credibility, you build trust. Bilateral partners trust Jamaica on fiscal matters. Multilaterals trust Jamaica. Markets, financial markets, local and overseas, trust Jamaica. Rating agencies trust Jamaica. They trust because we do what we say we will do. And, Madam Speaker, fiscal credibility can be leveraged. That is the way of the world. The United States gets the best credit terms in the entire world of any individual, any business, or any country. Why? Because they have credibility. One can trust the commitment of their institutions. Madam Speaker, we have leveraged Jamaica's hard-earned fiscal credibility to gain access to $1.7 billion of resources without much intrusion, barely a headline in our local newspapers. We have leveraged fiscal credibility to qualify for access to a precautionary and liquidity line. Jamaica has never before even been able to think of qualifying for such an instrument. Today, Jamaica enjoys yields with some of the lowest spreads above U.S. Treasury securities as compared with other countries of similar or slightly higher credit rating. None of this, Madam Speaker, would have been possible without fiscal credibility. We have also leveraged fiscal credibility to obtain grants to help us leverage to develop large infrastructure projects. Our catastrophe bond, Madam Speaker, is entirely financed by our bilateral partners, United Kingdom, the United States, and Germany. All because, Madam Speaker, of the fiscal credibility that this government, Madam Speaker, has been building. And how is fiscal credibility earned? It's earned by setting targets that are sustainable and based on a credible fiscal trajectory. And then also, Madam Speaker, it's earned by working hard to meet and surpass those targets and repeating these two things over and over. So, Madam Speaker, when we had the problem of tens of billions of dollars of resources, 30 billion for just 3 groups, but if we added other groups, it would have been more. Maybe 35, 40, I don't have the precise number. And we said that if it's not paid this year, we would have been in a challenging position to pay it next year, and therefore it would have to be stretched over a period of time beginning in the following fiscal year. There are some people who would have misinterpreted such a statement, or who would have chosen to misunderstand. What that simply represents, Madam Speaker, is that funds that are not used in a particular fiscal year cannot be transferred and used in another fiscal year, especially when our fiscal rules at this time require us to run a very modest positive fiscal balance. Now, some said, wait a minute, what about having a supplementary? Well, Madam Speaker, if supplementaries could be as magical as that, it would be great. But the truth is that we have had 7 supplementaries over the last 2 years where we have added to expenditure to significant degrees. But, Madam Speaker, in each of those cases, the expenditure that we have added has been supported by increasing revenues, Madam Speaker. If we are to be consistent with our fiscal rules, then net new expenditure can only be accommodated in a supplementary budgetary process if there are new revenues to support it. Some said, okay, what about rearranging items of expenditure to fit it in? Well, Madam Speaker, the nature of our fiscal accounts is quite rigid. And the reason for that, now that the expenditure is $1 trillion, it is relatively straightforward to sort of explain the structure of it. You start with $1 trillion of expenditure. 3 items, Madam Speaker: wages and salaries, interest expenditure, and pensions account for approximately 700 billion of that trillion, or 70%. Madam Speaker, you take the next 9 or 10 largest items of expenditure. The PATH program in all of its elements. The subvention to our universities, which is 15 billion. The funds for drugs and supplies in our hospital, which is another 15 billion. The amounts for the University Hospital of the West Indies, which is separate, which is about 10 billion. Subventions to the judiciary, which is 8 billion. To the JUTC, which is 7 billion. And by the way, the PATH program by itself is about 20 billion. The PATH program is only half of our total social assistance. Okay? And then you add amount for roads and bridges, that's another 6 billion. You add the amounts for streetlights, 3.1 billion. The amount for textbooks in schools, 2 billion. And you are already at 800 billion, Madam Speaker, or 80% of the budget, and you've only gone about 12 or 13 line items. You add operating expenses for MOCA, for the police, for the regional health authorities, and for the laboratories, Madam Speaker, and you're at 850 billion or 85% of the budget. You add capital expenditure, which at 2.2% of GDP is much less than optimal, and you're at 925 billion, with 75 billion left to cover all expenditure in all ministries, departments, and agencies. Madam Speaker, there is no way to force fit a single expenditure of $30 billion into that structure without precipitating a crisis. Now, because we have had these large supplementaries where we have had revenue over performance, over the last 2 years, there would have been a feeling that that just continues. Well, Madam Speaker, those supplementaries arose in the context of a ferocious recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic, where we grew by 14% in one quarter, by 8% in 2021, and by 5% projected in 2022-23. And so revenues responded, Madam Speaker, in a ferocious way, to use an expression, and that overperformance allowed us to sustain additional expenditures. Then, Madam Speaker, there are some, including members of opposition and an editorial in a newspaper, that suggested, hey, what about escrowing the amounts? After all, you escrowed the amount when you had to make the payment to Venezuela. You escrowed the amount due to the government of Venezuela for the purchase of the Petrojam shares. Well, Madam Speaker, we can only execute warrants against expenditure approved in Parliament through the budgetary process. The expenditure line item for the 30 billion is compensation, right? And in the case of the Venezuela escrow, we're dealing with a single beneficiary. Here, we would have 40,000 beneficiaries. And since the line item in the budget is compensation, the expenditure would have to meet the definition of compensation. So therefore, it couldn't be to a collective body. The 40,000 beneficiaries would basically have to have beneficial ownership of what was put away from it. There's no way logistically to have been able to get that done, Madam Speaker, and certainly not in the time frame that existed, if it was even possible to do it any at all. But, Madam Speaker, there are other problems with that escrow arrangement as well. There are too many for me to mention here, but I'll just mention one. And that is, in our arrangements, Madam Speaker, we certainly have to make provisions for the impact of expenditure. When we pay our wage bill of, whatever the amount is, everybody pays, has statutory payments that they have to remit. And those statutory payments are a part of budgetary revenues. So if we had a situation where $30 billion or more left the coffers of government without the associated revenue that would have been associated with it, fiscal targets would have been severely missed, with a hole in the budget that would have been punched. And as we just described, Madam Speaker, having missed our fiscal targets for the decade 2003-4 to 2012-13, Madam Speaker, and having established a new track record of meeting fiscal targets every single year and using fiscal credibility to the benefit of Jamaica, Madam Speaker, there was no way we could, Madam Speaker, and hence that 30 billion, hence our statement, it would have had to be paid over a number of years. Now, Madam Speaker, in these debates, the opposition has the luxury of never having to balance a budget. They don't have to balance, Madam Speaker. They can go so, they can go so, but they don't have to balance it out. They have to balance it out, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, they can advocate for reductions in areas of revenue, right? And at the same time, promote additional layers and layers of expenditure without ever having to tell the Jamaican people how they would achieve, Madam Speaker, without adding taxes on the back of Jamaican people, or without going back on the fiscal credibility that Jamaica has established. Madam Speaker, they can even suggest, imagine, slowing down the payment of debt without having to share with you the impact that that would have on Jamaica's credibility, how it would negatively affect the interest rates and yields that Jamaica has to pay, and how it would further increase the cost of the government and therefore lower fiscal space. But, Madam Speaker, in spite of that, every now and then, somebody on that side makes a sober, constructive, realistic, and achievable comments and suggestions. And I'd like to respond, Madam Speaker, to two of these. Madam Speaker, the opposition spokesperson raised the issue of the targeting methodology used by the PATH program. The opposition spokesperson, Madam Speaker, raised the issue of the targeting methodology used by the PATH program in light of his observation that persons who one would think ought to qualify are sometimes denied access to the program. I know, Madam Speaker, that other members of this House...
Just a moment. Apart from the crosstalk, the parliamentary language is missing. So even if we're going to crosstalk while the minister is speaking, let us try and use parliamentary language.
Yes, Madam Speaker, I was saying that the opposition spokesperson raised the issue of the targeting methodology in the PATH program in light of his observation that persons who one would think should qualify sometimes doesn't meet the benchmarks. And I know that other members of the House share this observation, and I consider it a valid point. Allow me, therefore, Madam Speaker, to update the House and him that the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, in collaboration with the Planning Institute of Jamaica, where the technical expertise lies, will be reviewing the targeting approach of the PATH program. It's important, Madam Speaker, to note that in the absence of reliable income data, the PATH program needs objective criteria that correlates with and can be used as predictors of poverty. So we can't ever get to a stage where it's what somebody think, I think said, or my belief is, or, I know this. No, it has to always be an objective reference. But objective references have to change over time. The objective references that we used 20 or 30 years ago, 23 years ago, when the PATH program began, are not relevant for today for a number of reasons and a variety of reasons. So working with the PIOJ, Madam Speaker, we're going to be able to run the regression analyses based on the data and survey of living conditions to look at the correlates to poverty in today's Jamaica and see if we can adjust and update the screening and targeting mechanism. Madam Speaker, using other language and vocabulary, the opposition spokesperson spoke about the need to transition to higher value-added sectors. On this, we agree. However, Madam Speaker, it's important to get the context, put the context in place. First of all, the opposition leader was absolutely inaccurate when he said that at the change in administration, which is in his written speech he had in 2015, I know that was an oversight, but in a change in administration, he claimed that the unemployment rate was 10%. Madam Speaker, that is incorrect. In April 2016, the unemployment rate, Madam Speaker, was 13.7%, Madam Speaker. Let me say that again, 13.7%. That's what we inherited, Madam Speaker. And under this government, Madam Speaker, and our policies, Madam Speaker, which differed from theirs, Madam Speaker, the unemployment rate, we are definitely at one on this, certainly with the Peter Phillips fiscal responsibility, we have definitely consistent with that. But otherwise, our policies, how we use the expenditure envelope differs from them. and our policies, Madam Speaker, achieved new historic record lows of unemployment, including in April 2022 when it fell to 6%. Now, I've put the graph up here for you to see, and this is a graph over the last 32 years of unemployment. And you can see that very large drop there, beginning in April 2016 on the right, okay? That is where, what I just referred to a while ago. But zooming out, Madam Speaker, and looking at it over a longer period of time, we're coming from a 27-year period of high double-digit unemployment. Madam Speaker, from 1990 to 2017, saving for 5 quarters alone, right? 5 quarters, Madam Speaker, out of 108 quarters. 5 out of 108. Unemployment was in double digits, Madam Speaker, from 1990 to 2017. Madam Speaker, it was this government that brought the back of double-digit unemployment, Madam Speaker, consistently so. Only broken by 2 quarters during COVID. You see that big spike? It's only 2 quarters during the COVID-19 pandemic where it breached the double-digit level. But under this government, Madam Speaker, since the end of 2017, we have had consecutive single-digit unemployment. Now, Madam Speaker, this is a precious achievement that must be protected. We cannot curse what we have, Madam Speaker. We have long toiled for higher levels of employment in our country. Prime Minister Manley would have wanted it. Prime Minister Patterson would have wanted it. Prime Minister Simpson Miller would have wanted it. Prime Minister Golding would have wanted it. Prime Minister Andrew Holness has introduced it, Madam Speaker. For 27 years, I don't even get the time frame, Madam Speaker, 27 years between 1990 and 2017, we suffered under double-digit unemployment, including 22 years under the rule of that side, with the exception of 5 quarters. 22 years of double-digit unemployment. Now, having achieved that, Madam Speaker, it's important that we value it. It has taken us so long to get here. And we protect it. And we build on it. So yes, it may be true that we don't have the highest paying, highest value-added jobs. But do we turn over what we have, Madam Speaker? No, not at all. My mother reminded me, Madam Speaker, that a bird in hand is worth 2 in the bush, Madam Speaker. The question is, how do we use what we have? How do we use what we have? A stable economy, entrenched stability, and robust employment to get to where we want to go. All countries ahead of us in the development ladder have had to transition, Madam Speaker, from decades of low-skilled, low-wage realities to eventually achieving a higher skilled, higher earning status. And this does not happen overnight in none of these countries. None of these countries. No, I'm covering it. I think you remember I said this is a point on which we agree. Okay? So none of this happens overnight. It is going to take planning, implementation, execution, and time. But in the meantime, Madam Speaker, regular, steady employment with supportive government programs allows for family units to secure a foundation that anchors Jamaica's social stability. The way to transition in scale, Madam Speaker, is through a combination of repurposing our education system focusing on improving competencies in areas essential for high-paying jobs: English, math, technology, and science. Continuing to invest in skills training and development. Pursuing business reforms that continue to attract higher value investments. And making the public investments that can transform existing sectors into higher yielding and therefore higher value added sectors. This is a process, Madam Speaker, but the direction is unmistakable. That is why, Madam Speaker, just to list a few initiatives, the Prime Minister commissioned the Orlando Patterson-led commission to produce a report to reform the education in Jamaica, and we're now focused on its implementation. It is why, Madam Speaker, we are providing 1,250 full tuition scholarships to Micah University, specifically to replenish math and science teachers in the education system and to improve education outcomes. It is why, Madam Speaker, we're providing 1,000 full tuition scholarships to children from lower-income households to pursue courses in computer science, data analytics, software engineering, all at UTEC. And this is just a start, Madam Speaker. It's why, as the Prime Minister announced, we are modernizing HEART with the formation of the HEART College of Innovation and Technology that will be focused on information security, mobile app design, mobile robotics, to produce higher earning jobs. It's why the Chocolate Hole campus at HEART, as the PM announced, will offer vocational training in optoelectronics, mechatronics, robotics, program logic control, geomatics and geospatial services, industrial electronics, and renewable energy. Again, Madam Speaker, for the vision for higher value-added jobs. It's why, as the PM announced, the National Tools and Engineering Institute will be a lab focused on training, Madam Speaker, and in instrumentation and electro, hydraulic, and pneumatic, Madam Speaker. It's why we're investing with the help of the IDB to upskill the workforce to attract higher value-added BPO jobs. It's why Minister Bartlett is working hard to diversify our tourism product, Madam Speaker, and we're working to introduce higher-end integrated resorts, which require higher value-added, higher-paying jobs. And we're about to issue the first integrated resorts license. Minister Bartlett will tell you that we're further diversifying our product in tourism with the introduction of more luxury premium personalized service resorts, where, Madam Speaker, an example, a personal chef can make 60,000 US, 80,000 US dollars a year, Madam Speaker. And there are developments on stream where every room will have a personal chef. So we are seized of the need to develop higher paying jobs in our country. And these are some of the things that we're doing. Madam Speaker, Minister Vaz, who is not here, will tell you all about the green revolution that's been launched with the RFP for renewable energy investment that will deliver higher paying green jobs. We are pursuing, as Minister Vaz will tell you, investment in a broadband network that will bring the cost of broadband data down for hundreds of thousands and make it more accessible. And Madam Speaker, as the opposition spokesman would have suggested, we are already doing the following. We're making the largest capital investment in agriculture, Madam Speaker. Over $12 billion across 2 fiscal years, 22-23 and 23-24, to build out irrigation, pumps, piping, storage, and farm road infrastructure, Madam Speaker, in St. Catherine, in Clarendon, in St. Elizabeth, Madam Speaker, through the Essex Valley and the Southern Plains agricultural development projects. This will deliver, Madam Speaker, higher value-added agriculture opportunities. And added to that, we're working on increasing the footprint in logistics with the development of the Caymanas Special Economic Zone, as the Prime Minister mentioned, which will attract investors in logistics activities, yielding higher paying jobs. By the way, Madam Speaker, By the way, Madam Speaker, as an aside, I saw a clip yesterday when the opposition leader referred to labor rights, Madam Speaker, or those who identify with a particular party known as the Jamaican Labour Party. And I can't say the words, but he said, beep fools. Beep fools. Call them beep fools. Madam Speaker, that never sound like Marty G to me. That sound like Massa Mark. Massa Mark, Madam Speaker. Anyways, Madam Speaker, we are immensely proud of the fact that this is the 6th consecutive year of no new taxes. With certainty, Madam Speaker, this has not happened in 50 years, that a government of Jamaica has gone 6 consecutive years with not one new revenue measure that introduces a new tax or raises a tax rate. No new taxes, Madam Speaker. And they pretend to not know what it means. Madam Speaker, when in the presentation of a new budget, the government of the day introduces no new revenue measure and no increase in tax rates, Madam Speaker, that is the definition of no new taxes. Madam Speaker, it seems to hurt them, Madam Speaker. It hurt them. And it hurt Master Mark too. It burned him.
On a point of order, Madam Speaker. No, on a point of order, Madam Speaker. On a point of order, Madam Speaker. On a point of order, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, I believe that the Minister of Finance, in terms of, shut your mouth and let me talk. I know you would find it. I know you would have a problem with that. I know you would have a problem with that. I know you would have a problem with that. No, I know you would have a problem with that.
Madam Speaker.
I know you would have a problem
Point
with
of
that.
order, Madam Speaker.
I've never made
No,
a
point of order.
I have not made my point.
Point of order,
I was
Madam
in a point of
Speaker.
order, and I want to be heard.
Point of order, Madam Speaker. A point of order, Madam Speaker.
I haven't said what I needed to say.
No, the member has used unparliamentary language
No, but
in
that
the
is
Honourable
exactly
House
what I was
by
raising. It is the
indicating
same point
that
I
the
was
member
making.
should shut his mouth.
Who is
That's
the Minister of
unparliamentary
Finance
language
referring to
for which he
as
must
Master
withdraw.
Mark?
And so it's
Who is
required.
he referring to as the Master
Unparliamentary
Mark in
language.
the Parliament?
That's it.
Who is he referring to
Madam
as
Speaker,
Master Mark?
you need to
That
name
is
the
not
member.
parliamentary language either.
Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, on a point of order, this Honourable House retains and must retain its status of being honourable. And one of the reasons that the standing order defines parliamentary language is to ensure that the honour of this House is never undermined. And members from time to time are required to use parliamentary language, especially in reference to other members of this Honourable House. And to say to members that they should shut their mouth in the style and manner that this member did, Madam Speaker, is unparliamentary and unbecoming of that member. And I move, therefore, that the member withdraws that unparliamentary comment with regards to the member.
Madam Speaker, to be fair to the member from Southwest St. Andrew, she had risen on a point of order, and I think in fairness, she really ought to be heard, Madam Speaker.
this house is that two wrongs. Please. Let me say that everybody who gets up to make a point of order and does so within the limits of the standing order, and I was just about to allow the member from St. Catherine Southwestern, but her behavior and her language, if you withdraw, hold a minute, if you withdraw that unparliamentary language, of course you'll be allowed. And I'm not going to renege from that. Please withdraw those words because it, for a couple, there's some unparliamentary language that has been used recently. And I'm saying to you now, unless you, and it is unfortunate that even as we try to have order, I have a right. Hold a minute, Minister. I have a right to speak. Go ahead.
Madam Speaker, the inconsistency in the House.
Please allow me to hear what her point of order is. The member's point of order.
That the point of order I was raising, Madam Speaker, is a fact.
Have you withdrawn the behavior? If you do not withdraw,
Madam Speaker, I'm trying to follow your instructions,
yes,
but you're going back and forth. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I rose and started there, and then you asked me what was the point of order. Madam Speaker, the inconsistency in the House is glaring, but I will say this. No, Madam Speaker, you have asked me if I'm going to withdraw
your words,
allow
and
me
then
to,
you
allow
can go
me
ahead.
to do it. If I'm to withdraw it, I'm not going to do it on your terms. You don't have the right. No, I'm not. No, I am not going to do it on your terms. I am willing to withdraw it, but not on your terms. Not while you try to shut me up. The members over there say shut him out every day, and you have nothing to say about it. Nothing.
Unfortunately.
And that is the inconsistency to which I speak.
Unfortunately, the standing orders.
I am willing to withdraw that. I am willing to withdraw saying it.
Madam.
I am willing to withdraw saying it. But you cannot beat me over the head. You cannot beat me into submission by into how it is done.
Hold a minute. I am not beating anybody's head in here. I am following the standing orders. And in these standing orders, the Speaker's ruling is correct. And you stand by it. Your behavior is unparliamentary. Your behavior is unparliamentary. Go right ahead.
Madam Speaker, on a point of order.
I just
on a
ruled.
Point, I'm not, Madam Speaker.
I just ruled that the minister will continue his. What is your point of order?
My point. On a point of order, Madam Speaker.
You have just returned after a little while.
Madam Speaker, I'm not sure how my absence from the House.
No, I am not finished I'm saying.
How does my absence from the House?
I have not finished my sentence.
But you colored it.
I am completing to say that during these debates, there have been a lot of unparliamentary behavior that has taken place. And the member rose for a point of order. I allowed her to stand, and her behavior was totally
Madam Speaker, I was not relating to the member's behavior. That was not what my point of order was about. And certainly one of the things that I would like clarified, and it doesn't have to be here, but I think what has happened has created a degree of tension at this point. And I'm asking you if we could be advised what is unparliamentary language according to the standing orders. The reason why I am asking, Madam Speaker, is because from time to time, both sides hurl different words, and from time to time, reactions are given. Perhaps, and I knew there was a women's caucus, and some of these things were discussed. And if we really are trying to build any kind of consensus across the aisles, there has to be some degree or appear to be fairness. All I'm asking is, moving forward, what is considered unparliamentary? Because I've heard that word shouted from both sides all the time.
Yes, but member, when you get up to make a point of order, you don't stand on your feet in making that point of order, and that is my ruling, and shout when you are on your feet to make your point of order and say what you say. Shut up your mouth like that. I am saying to you, you have asked permission in the middle of a presentation for a point of order to be made. The opportunity has been given to you, and this is the way it is done, and I think it is most unparliamentary. So therefore, that is my ruling. So may we ask the member...
Madam Speaker,
I really would like the member to continue.
I know, Madam Speaker, but just to, Madam Speaker, the member did rise on the issue of the characterization of the leader of the opposition as Master Mark. And I think in that is the unparliamentary language reference that the member from Southwest St. Andrew was in fact referring to. And the member from Southwest St. Catherine is the least capable of making these clarifications.
But
member,
Madam Speaker,
opposition, I just speak.
No, but I'm saying the sort of vote comment from the member,
what's that?
which was that he's a descendant of a slave master. That's what was said over there. Madam Speaker, but that is a point that I'm making.
That comment.
But that is a point that I'm making, Madam Speaker.
Member, I am saying to you, as I said, members, please allow me. I can't speak while you're speaking. I'm saying to you, I cannot rule on a comment that I did not hear. The member stood on a point of order, and I allowed her, I expected her, I said, what is your point of order? And I'm waiting, and then I heard her outburst. That I cannot rule on something that I did not hear. If I hear a comment, I most certainly am not afraid to rule on either side of the aisle. I did not hear the comment. I was waiting for her. I was waiting for the member to raise a point of order when that outburst came from her. And I consider that that outburst, when she stood on her feet, was unparliamentary. I did not hear the comment that you have now referred to. Yes. I did. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I never did.
So I can empathize with that. All I'm saying is that where we are now, there is clearly some work on and tension that is amiss. And is we want to be able to work together across the aisle. And I'm saying to you, in the best interest of this country, I cannot have a colleague who sits in this parliament, all of us are colleagues in here, who leaves this way. And I'm asking you as a speaker, we have to find a way to have better relationships. And I'm hoping that it can be rectified, even though she has left the chamber.
Member,
That cannot be good.
can I say something? I have ruled in a matter where I allowed the member, please allow me, to get up and make a point of order. You have raised something that I did not hear. I cannot, I will not. I said it last week and I maintain. I cannot rule on something that I did not hear. And for the records, I have an excellent relationship with most members on your side of the aisle. I have a good relationship with a member from Southwest, but it does not stop me from ruling on what I heard and saw. And then when I spoke to her, there was a big argument, and she declared openly that she will not, I don't want to quote her, but she will not withdraw on my thing. And I don't want to prolong this because to every, member, I am allowing the minister. I am not going to have any more distractions. I am going to allow the minister to complete his debate. Do you notice that your leader of opposition business is still sitting in the house? When you walk out, it doesn't allow for any sort of reconciliation. And I have no animosity on the other side. So I'm going to ask now that the Minister of Finance completes his presentation.
Madam Speaker, the reason why this is on the tax issue, is such a point where there's an attempt to obfuscate, is that the opposition knows their record on this matter of heaping tax after tax year after year on the people. And as them say, Madam Speaker, you can fool some of the people some of the time, but you can't fool them all of the time. Because even the opposition understands what no new taxes means. Madam Speaker, I want to give you Exhibit A. In 1990, after then Finance Minister Seymour Mullings delivered his budget presentation, there were no new revenue measures and there was no increase in taxes. The headline was, "It is a no tax budget," Madam Speaker. No tax budget. Look at him beaming with pride on the front page of the Gleaner in May 11th of 1990. Madam Speaker, they have long known the currency, Madam Speaker, of no taxes in a budget presentation, and they made a big deal of it. Now, did tax revenue stay flat in 1990-91 after no new taxes were introduced? Not at all, Madam Speaker. Tax revenues in that same year when no new taxes were introduced. Tax revenues in that same year, Madam Speaker, went up by 23%, Madam Speaker. Yes. Madam Speaker, it took them 7 years to repeat this no new tax, which means all of those other years they're hiking taxes every year. And in April 1997, 7 long years after the no new tax budget in 1990, Dr. Omar Davies, the then finance minister, was pleased as a pumpkin on the front page. What does it say? No new taxes. No, Madam Speaker, the opposition leader tries to distract away from this achievement of no new taxes. The one who was there before. Even in 2001, Madam Speaker, 4 years later, even when the government hiked custom fees and certain fixed stamp fees, but there were no new taxes introduced, the budget was still, Madam Speaker, no new taxes, Madam Speaker. No new taxes. Now, did it mean, Madam Speaker, that tax revenues didn't increase in this year? Absolutely not. Tax revenues did increase because they increased for other reasons. Right? But they know the currency and value of no new taxes. They only have 5 of them out of 22 years, so don't worry. 3 years later, Madam Speaker, but I wanted to show you the hypocrisy. 3 years later, Madam Speaker, in April 2004, after successive years of revenue measures and tax increases, again came no new taxes from them, Madam Speaker. Right? This is now 2004. You understand the currency of it. They're aware of it. Because whenever they introduced it, they made the most of it. Huge headline, no new taxes. And Madam Speaker, did it mean that in 2004, 2005, tax revenues did not increase? Tax revenue inflows increased by 15% in the same year of no new taxes. And Madam Speaker, 2 years later, in 2006, there were no revenue measures in that year and no increase in taxes that year. And so guess what, Madam Speaker? Dr. Davies came proudly, front page of the newspaper again. No new taxes. No new taxes. Now, again, I ask the question, did tax revenue inflows stay flat this year because there were no new taxes? Not at all. Tax revenue inflows increased by 16% in this particular year, even though there was no new taxes. Madam Speaker, no new taxes means the same thing today as it did yesterday. It means the same thing in the 6 consecutive budgets that we have had, 2018-19, 2019-20, 2020-21, 21-22, 22-23, and 23-24, Madam Speaker. It means the same as it did in 1990 and 97, 01, 04, and 06. And I wanted to ask opposition leader, Madam Speaker, who was close to Dr. Davies then, who is his political mentor, Madam Speaker, when he announced no new taxes in 2001, 2004, and 2006, and tax revenues went up that year, did you do as you did in your presentation last week and tell him how hollow the refrain is? Or is that phrase, Madam Speaker, only referring to the people who he called yesterday or the day before or whenever it was in that unfortunate video clip? Huh? Is it only for those only for fools? When they do it once in a blue moon, Madam Speaker, they want to be able to say no new taxes, no new taxes. When they do it once in a blue moon. We do it 6 years in a row, Madam Speaker. And they want to trick the people. Such hypocrisy, Madam Speaker. There are some people, Madam Speaker, who seem intent to trick their way. Not calling any names. Because you know full well, Madam Speaker, what no new taxes means. You know how tax revenue inflows can increase in an economy due to real GDP growth, due to inflation, due to nominal GDP growth, and other factors, even if there are no new taxes. But, Madam Speaker, opposition leader want to confuse and trick the people with that kind of generalship, Madam Speaker. But I must say to you, the time for that mentality, that Mr. mentality, that time gone, long time. Jamaican people don't need, Madam Speaker. don't need to listen to the opposition leader to determine what is happening. Right? That mentality is when you think that people depend on you to find out what is happening. That mentality is when you think that people depend on you to determine how to think. Jamaican people can think for themselves. Yes, times are hard, and yes, cost of living has gone up. But it's also true that increased allocations to social assistance programs under this government have risen as rapidly as tax revenues have. And I'm going to show you those tables later on. And it is also true that not only have we introduced no new taxes, but we have reduced taxes, Madam Speaker, and introduced no new ones for 6 consecutive years. Now, Madam Speaker, you notice how every time they announce no new taxes, you notice how many times it makes the headline of the paper. Yeah? Huh? Make front page news when they announce it. Front page news every time they announce it. Front page news, no new taxes. Yeah? But the reason for that, though, Madam Speaker, is that people were not accustomed to it under them. So every time it happened, it was new. Madam Speaker, it is only 5 times. There's one in 1997 that I was on my chart, but it's not reproduced in large form. Only 5 times, Madam Speaker, in their last 22 years in power, between 1989 and 2007, and between 2012 and 2016, that they had years with no new taxes. 5 times out of 22. So what that means is that in that 17 of the 22 years that they were in power, they spent what the country did not have and heaped tax up top of tax on the Jamaican people to make up the difference. And Madam Speaker, they come here and try to confuse people as to what taxes look like. But I want to show you, I want you to see graphically what 17 years of tax measures looks like. These are the tax measures. Every one of the pink sheets is a new one. Run it around the parliament. Let's see how long it stretched. These are all the tax measures introduced by them, Madam Speaker. 17 years of tax measures, Madam Speaker. Not one of these papers have we introduced in 6 years, Madam Speaker. Take it all across the parliament. 17 years, Madam Speaker, of tax increases. This is all of them here. This is it. It can't even hold in the parliament. All of the tax increases, Madam Speaker, over 17 years cannot hold in this parliament, Madam Speaker. And this is what he wants to come and tell the Jamaican people, that when we say no new taxes, this is what it is like. He has some nerve, Madam Speaker. Oh, let's take. Madam Speaker, half of it has not yet been distributed. Half of it has not been distributed. 17 years of tax measures, Madam Speaker, under their management. Now, Madam Speaker, we were tested. We went through a pandemic. We lost 15 years of revenues, or $75 billion. Unlike many governments in this region and around the world, we took our commitment to people seriously, and we managed the crisis and the recovery without introducing any new taxes, Madam Speaker. In fact, we reduced taxes by reducing the GCT by 1.5 percentage points from 16.5 points to 15 percentage points, Madam Speaker. So with these examples, Madam Speaker, I'm showing that across time, it is normal and can be expected that even when there are no new taxes introduced in a fiscal year, tax revenue inflows still increase over the prior year. We have seen that happen on 5 occasions over the 22 years that opposition was in power. Despite no new taxes, tax revenues increased by 23 points in 1991, 5 points in 1997, 6% in 2001, 16% in 2004, and 15% in 2006. That's normal and natural. Yet he can stand here in Parliament and tell the Jamaican people that because tax revenues have gone up, that no new taxes is some 5 business. Imagine that. Talk about unparliamentary language. Madam Speaker, Mr. Golding made, so I want you to look at that chart there, right? Those are, you can, it's clear. Okay, you see what tax revenues did, and you see that. Now, opposition leader made a big hullabaloo about increases in tax revenue inflows. Let me say this, you can't run a country with inflows of tax revenues growing from, without inflows of tax revenues growing from one year to the next. And we are simply able to grow tax revenues without increasing taxes, Madam Speaker. So tax revenues are projected to have increased by approximately 80% between the period 2016-17 and 2023-24 by 80%, which is about 8.7% per annum compounded. Well, you know what, Madam Speaker? We have increased allocations to the school feeding program between 2016-17 and amounts budgeted for 23-24 by 103%, Madam Speaker, ahead of tax revenue growth. I want to say that again. So tax revenue growth, Madam Speaker, is on the left. Tax revenue over the 7 years, 2016-17, to what is projected for 23-24, has increased by 80% over 7 years on the left-hand side. But school feeding, Madam Speaker, the budgetary allocation to school feeding over the same period has increased by 103%, faster than tax revenue growth. Madam Speaker, allocations to the Poor Relief Department have increased by 90% between 2016-17 and amount budgeted for 23-24. Again, faster than tax revenue growth. With the introduction of the social pension, the allocations for other social programs in the Ministry of Labour and Social Security, including the rehabilitation grant and social intervention programs, increased collectively by 326%, Madam Speaker, faster than tax revenue growth. In fact, Madam Speaker, the government's total social assistance programs, including the ones above that I mentioned, but adding to that the program for drugs and medical supplies and grants in the Ministry of Health, the PATH cash grant program, the PATH social assistance grants, the education and subsistence inclusive of the PATH school transportation, the PATH examination fees, the secondary school book textbook program, and support to children in basic schools, Madam Speaker. When you add all of Jamaica's the government social assistance programs, those increase from $22 billion in 2016-17 to $40 billion in 23-24, not including the care program, I'm excluding the care program, which was an increase, Madam Speaker, it so happened to be 80%. So as we get tax revenue growth, Madam Speaker, we increase social support to the vulnerable. Madam Speaker, the opposition leader tries to suggest, so I want that to be clear, right? That we can't run the country without tax revenue growth. But the policy of this administration has been that as the numbers show, as tax revenues increase, we increase our support to social programs, sometimes for some categories above the rate of tax revenue increase, but overall, it mirrors the tax revenue increase over the 7 years of this government. Now, Madam Speaker, the opposition tries to suggest that increases in revenue flows between 21-22 and 23-24 specifically somehow diminishes no new taxes. And he points to a 34% increase in tax revenues over those 2 fiscal years and compares it with accumulated inflation over that period, which is projected to be which he projected at 12.3%. But Madam Speaker, this is a technically flawed comparison. And he should know better, Madam Speaker. Tax revenues are known to have a relationship with the level of nominal GDP and not inflation as an isolated variable by itself. Madam Speaker, you wouldn't even get an E or an F for writing in an economics exam that inflation is appropriate comparator. You know what you'd get, Madam Speaker? You get a G. And Madam Speaker, when you look at nominal GDP growth over the period of that comparison from 21-22 to 23-24, you'll see that nominal GDP is projected to have increased from $2.3 trillion to $2.96 trillion, an increase of 27%, which compares favorably with a 34% increase in revenues over that time. And he makes much of this $200 billion, so he does it in percentage and then in dollar terms, Madam Speaker. $200 billion increase in tax revenues between 21-22 and 23-24. But what he omits in the presentation, Madam Speaker, is that tax revenues actually declined by $75 billion during the middle of the pandemic. So the subsequent forecasted $200 billion increase in tax revenues, and there's a graph that shows it, simply restores tax revenue growth to its pre-pandemic trajectory. So you'll see that he talks about the $200 billion increase, but he doesn't tell you that it declined by $75 billion a year before. So that increase just put the government back on its pre-COVID revenue growth trajectory, which is about 8.7% per annum. And as I mentioned, that was the growth on our social programs mirrored the tax growth that we have. Now, thank God for this recovery, Madam Speaker, because how else would we have paid for the compensation restructuring? So the question as to the use of how did that $200 billion increase in tax revenues was used, the answer is simple. The line item, public sector wages and salaries, increased by 50% or $117 billion over that 2-year period. And it was powered by increased tax revenues of $200 billion. Capital expenditure increased by 50%. And by the way, that was a 50% increase in public sector wages over that time period. Capital expenditure also increased by 50% or $25 billion over that period. And spending on programs increased by $20 billion over that period. And what opposition leader is not reminding you of is that in 21-22, the government benefited from a one-off non-tax revenue dividend from the BOJ, which was used to offset expenditure that year. And because it was one-off and not repeatable, and therefore did not have recourse to that in future years, tax revenue growth had to make up for that one-off payment. Are you following me? Yes. So very roughly, Madam Speaker, that $200 billion in tax revenue increase to which he referred, $117 billion went to salary and wages, 8 billion for employers' contribution on salaries and wages, 25 billion for capex, 20 billion for programs increase, and 30 billion reduction in non-tax revenue because the dividend was no longer available. Now, clearly, in the scheme of $800 billion of expenditure, these are not the only changes. But I'm just saying, looking at if you look at the change of the overall back number. Now, it's important, Madam Speaker, for those who may have been genuinely confused by his presentation to spell it out. Because, and now just bear with me, there's a few moments left. Tax revenues increase, Madam Speaker. Tax revenues broadly are related to tax rates and economic activity. And economic activity is related to the price of transactions and the number of transactions. So tax revenue is essentially tax rate times the price of a transaction times the number of transactions. And I had brought something to kind of just demonstrate it a little bit. Right, so we are very clear. And I'm just going to ask you to bear with me while I do so. Because one of the challenges that we have, Madam Speaker, is misinformation. And wherever that misinformation creeps up, we have to have the courage to explain it to the people so they're not confused. So, Madam Speaker, tax revenues, Madam Speaker, are related. So we have tax revenues, right? And I bought my pen because I can't write on it. Right? Tax revenues, maybe a little lean, are related, yes, to the rate of tax, but not only the rate of tax. All right, so tax revenues are related to the rate of tax. It's related to the level of prices in the economy. And the level of prices can be the prices for goods or the prices of labor, right? And it's related to the volume of transactions. So he wants to make it some euphemism or some for tax rates, but that would not be accurate. So what we have, Madam Speaker, is that, and I'm going to write it and show you. We have, for everybody to understand, right? We have tax rates, Madam Speaker, are equal to tax revenue, tax rates, times level of prices, times the volume of transactions. Does that make sense, right? So, Madam Speaker, tax revenues can increase, right, without clearly, I'm stating the obvious that everybody's aware of, but opposition leader tried to obfuscate. Tax revenues can increase, Madam Speaker, with tax rates constant if the level of prices have increased and or the volume of transactions have increased. Right? The relationship between tax revenues, right, is such that tax revenues are related to tax rates times the level of prices times the volume of transactions. And tax rates can go up with tax revenues can go up with tax rates being constant or even tax rates going down if the level of prices goes up and or the volume of transactions go up. Now, we know that under this government, tax rates actually went down. Right? Tax rates went down. Everybody knows that. GCT went down from 16.5% to 15%. Asset tax was on non-financial business was abolished. Stamp duty was abolished on real estate transactions. Transfer tax was obliterated. Export tax on goods under $500 was obliterated, and so on. Right? So Tax revenues we have seen go up, went up, even though tax rates went down, because volumes went up and prices went up. So instead of explaining the thing to the people, what we have is coming here bamboozling through some big number and confusing, man speak, and frankly, misrepresenting what has happened. No, not at all. I wouldn't have to do this, Madam Speaker, if he didn't try to confuse the Jamaican people. If he came with different arguments, I wouldn't have to do this. But I'm not, my responsibility, tolerate the deliberate obfuscation and confusion of the Jamaican people with misinformation, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, I wanted to give you some examples of how this works, right? There are 52,000 more cars in Jamaica on the road today than prior to the pandemic. 52,000. That means more tires, more batteries, more spare parts. And what does that mean, Madam Speaker? That's more volume over here. It means more tax revenues, Madam Speaker. And why are people having 52,000 more cars? Because, well, I ask you to reflect on that. Madam Speaker, there are 1.269 million people employed as of April 2022. That's 150,000 more than in 2020 and 69,000 more than in 2021. What does that mean? It means more revenue, more people are spending, more people have money. So, Madam Speaker, even in spite of that, though, the biggest unfortunate part of the delivery is to somehow try to fool Jamaicans that only Jamaicans contribute to government tax revenues. You remember that part of his presentation where he took the tax revenues, divided by the number of people and say the average Jamaican is paying X, Y, Z. It's faulty analysis. And that's easy to demonstrate, Madam Speaker. But let me come back to that in a second. I'm going to come back to that about all Jamaicans. And just, along with the analogy of increased volumes, a good indicator of of economic activity is trade. And imports declined by 26% or $1.7 billion US in 2020. As imports declined, so did tax revenues, customs duty, GCT. Madam Speaker, imports grew by 25% or $1.2 billion in 2021 versus 2020. Now, when imports grow by $1.2 billion US, 25% in a single year, what do you think is going to happen to revenues? Tax revenues associated with imports grow. And to provide concrete examples, Madam Speaker, just 4 examples of goods. Ceramic imports were up 60% in 2022 as compared to 2020, and up 25% compared to 2019. Paper was up by 45%, and this is net weight, this is not dollars. Up by 45% in 2022 as compared with compared to 2020, and 17% over 2019. Glass and glassware was up 54% in 2022 compared to 2020, and 50% up over 2019. Aluminum imports were up by 35% in 2022. Iron and steel imports were up by 17% in 2022 compared to 2020. Dairy and eggs up 35% in 2022 compared to 2020. So when you have those volume increases, you're going to get additional revenue. Now, as I was saying, to me, one of the most unfortunate examples is to say to the Jamaican people that all the tax revenue that government gets, you pay all of it. Nothing could be further from the truth, Madam Speaker. We have 3 million stopover tourists who visit Jamaica, who are projected to visit Jamaica in 2022. In 2020, we had 880,000. In 2021, 1.5 million. And in 2022, 3 million. Now, when you go from 880,000 visitors to 1.5 million visitors, to 3 million visitors in such a short space of time. At our guest houses and villas and hotels, what do you think happens to revenues? It goes up, Madam Speaker. Tourists consumes in the hotel and out of the hotel, and these transactions, either directly or indirectly, generate revenue for the government. Now, so revenue, Madam Speaker, is not all from Jamaican residents. Now, the easiest example to show it is just to look at travel tax receipts, which declined $75 billion to $5.4 billion in 2020-21. And it is expected to go from $5 billion in 2020-21 to $28 billion in 23-24. No, it was 21 billion before the pandemic. But I'm saying from the lows of 2020 that Mr. Golding doesn't want to tell you about, we have tax revenues, not one, well, very little of it or a minority of it paid by Jamaicans, going up by 431% from $5 billion to $28.7 billion. And Madam Speaker, now, there was a part, Madam Speaker, where he spoke about tax revenues as a percentage of GDP, going from 24.4 in 2015-16, projected to 28.2 as a percentage of GDP. And the explanation for this is more of a technical nature. It's clearly not due to the tax rates that are being implied. But, Madam Speaker, when you look at tax expenditures, and every year in the budget documents, we produce a tax expenditure statement, not something that's often commented on or read. And a tax expenditure is essentially any potential revenue loss occurring as a result of specific provisions that lead to a reduction of tax payable by a specific taxpayer activity. When you adjust for tax expenditures, Madam Speaker, I have a table up here, and you add back the lost revenue due to waivers and other things, if you could show it, what you see, Madam Speaker, is that tax revenue as a percentage of GDP is far more stable. Oh, you may not be there. Where instead of going from 24.4, with tax expenditures in 15-16 was 3.9%, which means total tax as a percentage of GDP was 28.3. And you compare it with 21-22, where tax as a percentage of GDP rose to 26.5, but you add the tax expenditure, which was lower at 2.5 points, and you get 29. I'll distribute that chart separately because it's not available here. But there are sectors in our economy, Madam Speaker, that have more tax expenditures than others. And occasionally, the economy goes through, a rotation of, caused by external forces and factors outside of our control. And depending on the sectors that are, depending on the relative contribution and weights to GDP, if tax expenditures are a big feature of that particular sector, it can impact the tax revenues as a proportion of GDP. I need more to be able to delve into more detail on that point, and this may not be the forum to do so, but suffice to say that the reduction in tax expenditure over the period 2015-16 to 21-22 on account of better and tighter tax administration has, accounts for some of that observation. In addition to the fact, Madam Speaker, that transfer pricing has played a role in yields, as well as the Assecuda system at customs, allowing for cross-references. PAYE payrolls can be interrogated now and cross-referenced to determine if an employee has benefited twice from the threshold. There are a number of more lawyers working in compliance, Madam Speaker, and the efficiency of the GCT net and collection, Madam Speaker, is a lot higher. So, Madam Speaker, he also made reference to how the policy approach that we chose to protect the vulnerable as prices rose last year. And this House will recall that we launched a $7 billion social intervention program. I won't go through all the details here, but the $2 billion energy copay, where the persons who consume at the lowest ends of the energy consumption ladder benefited from a 20% copay, in addition to persons who were on prepaid electricity. And this benefited 470,000 households, Madam Speaker, in the months of April, May, June, and July of last year. We also had implemented a one-off back-to-school grants of 1.8 billion, and pensioners who were at the lower end of the spectrum benefited from 550 million, as well as non-path beneficiaries, another 550 million. Now, the thing about it, Madam Speaker, if we implemented the way the opposition would have wanted us to, which is to reduce the headline prices, the NIS pensioner who is on $14,000 or $10,000 a month would not benefit from that. The social pensioner would be unlikely to benefit from that. The persons who consume, who live in one room, have a fan, a radio, a television, a little refrigerator, maybe a room and a half, Madam Speaker, they most likely would not be able to benefit from that. We intervene directly to assist those who are at the bottom of the consumption ladder. So, Madam Speaker, it is necessary to respond to especially misleading claims. And I have spent some time in doing so with the most misleading claim in the budget presentation, debate so far. Madam Speaker, the government is focused on maintaining, preserving, protecting, increasing, and sharing the gains of economic reform and economic recovery. And this is something, Madam Speaker, that we will continue to do. We are focused, Madam Speaker. We believe, Madam Speaker, that we share what is produced. We believe that if we share what is not there, we won't have much to share the next day, Madam Speaker. And we are absolutely focused on making sure that those who are at the bottom are protected, Madam Speaker. And that is why the minimum wage would have been increased by 44% by the Prime Minister. That is why, Madam Speaker, contract workers, we're going to find permanent employment for them. That is why the NIS rate, Madam Speaker, NIS pensions are going up by 74%. And that is why, Madam Speaker, we are ensuring that we have scholarships for persons who want to be exposed to higher value added areas or jobs and who can qualify to get into UTEC. We provide in full tuition and scholarship for them. We are absolutely focused, Madam Speaker. It is a vision of this administration built on labor, Madam Speaker, that rose out of the bowels of the labor labor riots, or after the labor riots, Madam Speaker, in 1944, founded on a foundation, Madam Speaker, of support for all Jamaicans, but particularly those who are in vulnerable positions and for whom government support can make the most difference. That is our focus, and a focus for which we don't shy away from, Madam Speaker. It is why, even in our compensation reform, we made sure that persons who were close to minimum wage, drivers, Madam Speaker, the salary scale for drivers, Madam Speaker, went up by over 70%, Madam Speaker, to make sure that drivers and office attendants and persons at the bottom of the scale in the public sector were able to have a living wage. There's a time that the public sector would be characterized as the highest or the largest employer of minimum wage in Jamaica, Madam Speaker. I want to say to you right here that under this government, that is no longer the case. And that's even with minimum wage at the elevated levels. The scales in government are a bit up from where minimum wage is. And that, Madam Speaker, doesn't happen by accident. That happens through planning and having a disposition, Madam Speaker, to make sure that we meet our targets. Because it's the targets that give us credibility. But when the credibility delivers return, we turn around and share those returns with the people of Jamaica. Madam Speaker, this has been a good debate process, lasting over 2 weeks with interesting presentations. And Madam Speaker, there's a lot of work that has been announced in these budget presentations. A lot of work to be done. And we want to be able to stand here in a future debate and not only and to be able to speak about some of the things that we announced as implemented. And to do so, Madam Speaker, we're going to have to move with alacrity as the new year begins to put, Madam Speaker, the fire behind the engine, or in the engine, to ensure that all of these plans and programs and policies and projects are implemented within budget and on time so that we can continue to deliver for the people of Jamaica who sent us here. I thank you, Madam Speaker, and may God bless Jamaica and bless all Jamaicans. Yeah, just come back for it. I'm going to give you the stuff you take.
To move for the bill to be read a second.
Madam Speaker, I ask for the bill to be read a second time.
Members, the question before the House is that the bill be read a second time. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Apply a Sum out of the Consolidated Fund to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2024 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament. Read a second time.
Members, the House will now resolve itself into a committee of the whole House to consider the bill clause by clause. Members, I put clause 1. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. I put clause 2. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. I put clause 3. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. I put the schedule, sections 2 and 3. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. I put the title and enacting clause. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. The question is that I do report the bill to the House as having passed without amendments. Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. Members of the House, I do report the bill as having passed committee stage without any amendments. I now ask Minister of Finance.
Madam Speaker, I ask that the bill be read a third time.
The question is that the bill be read a third time.
Those in favor?
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
A bill entitled an act to apply a sum out of the consolidated fund to the service of the year ending on the 31st day of March 2024 and to appropriate the sums granted in this session of Parliament for the third time and passed.
Members, House Leader, I want.
Madam Speaker, it is not intended to do any further business for today. Permit me, Madam Speaker, to, on the motion of adjournment, to really congratulate the Honorable Minister of Finance for the sterling work he has done and the tremendous performance he has put in today and the wonderful presentation overall that he's made to this budget debate. I therefore ask, Madam Speaker, that the House be adjourned until Tuesday, March 28 at 2 p.m. at the George William Gordon House. May it please you, Madam Speaker.
Members, just before